Take some photos. Stand up, John. Stand up.
Okay, welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. I'm Richard Vaughtry. I'm the president of the Royal College of GPs, and it's my privilege and honour to welcome you to this 2024 William Pickles Award. I'm a GP in Leeds, and so as a proud Yorkshireman, it feels a good place to be to recognise another Yorkshireman in the terms of William Pickles. The lecture is given every year to celebrate the achievements of a college member in the field of medical education. And this year we're really pleased to be able to award the honour to Professor Joe Rosenthal. Joe is a GP and Professor of Primary Care Education at the University College London, just over the road. And after an initial degree in psychology, he qualified in medicine in Cardiff in 1986. You'd never think he was so young, would you? Following postgraduate training in general practice at Guy's Hospital, Joe joined what was then the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine as lecturer in general practice in 1990, becoming senior lecturer in general practice in 1995 and professor of primary care education in 2018. And for 22 years, he's also been grounded as a GP partner in a practice in Haringey, and is now a part-time salaried GP in Islington, as well as an honorary consultant in primary care at NHS North Central in East London and at the Royal Free NHS Foundation Trust. He co-chairs the Society for Academic Primary Care Heads of GP Teaching Group, the national representative body for GP education in UK medical schools, and he's the programme director of the Royal Free GP Specialty Training Programme and lead for integrated academic clinical training in general practice at UCL. He's also published at least 4 textbooks for GPs and GP trainees, including recently co-editing Teaching General Practice, the first SAPC RCGP National Curriculum Guide for Undergraduate General Practice, and Learning General Practice, its companion study for a resource for medical students. He's also the co-lead editor of Virtual Primary Care, a video library of real-life primary care consultations, which is now available for use in all UK and Irish medical schools. It's therefore a great pleasure to invite Joe Rosenthal to the lectern to deliver this 2024 William Pickles Lecture and to award him his medal. Joe.
you very much. Well, this is nice. Well, what can I say? Good evening, President, College, colleagues and friends. Thank you so much, Richard, for your kind introduction. You've actually saved me the first 30 minutes of my lecture. So I might be touching on some of those points again. And thank you for this lovely medal. Let me show people. Has anyone seen a William Pickles medal before? I don't think I've had a medal since my bronze swimming medal at primary school. I shall treasure them both always. Thank you. The 2024 William Pickles Lecture. It really is an honour. Thank you. Thank you. I want it back. Yeah. It really is an honour to follow so many distinguished predecessors who have taken this podium since Pat Byrne, of Byrne and Long fame to the GPs in the room, gave the first Pickles lecture in 1968. Pickles was a Yorkshireman. I'm actually a Scouser, like Pat Byrne. Pat Byrne is in Liverpool. So before going any further, I'd like to share with you this list of previous Pickles lecturers. I don't think we look at it perhaps often enough. I'm very honoured to join this list. Many familiar names, I'm sure, to those of you in our world of GP education. And I'm grateful to all of them for paving the way for me and for all of us in the GP world. But there are actually 4 names on this list I've highlighted here that I want to say a personal thank you to. Bob McKinley sends his apologies. He's in Paris, but he said he'll try and tune in on YouTube. If you're there, hi Bob. We've worked together a lot over the years, and he gave the 2018 Pickles lecture, and I will be unapologetically picking up some of your themes, Bob. Val Wass, who gave the 2013 lecture, was later kind enough to invite me to join her by choice, not by chance, Task and Finish group, as it was called, whose report I think really was a landmark in promoting undergraduate GP education. And Amanda is here. Amanda Haub. Hi, Amanda, thank you so much for coming, who I'm delighted to see today, because in her time as both Vice Chair and President of this college, she really was a great support to me and to undergraduate GP teaching, and helped us move things significantly forward. And last but not least, Roger Jones. I'm proud to say that Roger, former editor of the BJGP, British Journal of General Practice, has been both a close friend and a mentor to me for almost 30 years. I know he would really love to be here in person to see you all today. He would be in his element, but as many of you know, he's not well at the moment. I'm delighted, however, that Janice is here. Professor Janice Reimer, one of my very best friends, Roger's wife, is here to join the fun. So Roger, if you're listening, we wish you were here, amigo, and get well soon. And if there's really one thing that I would like to achieve for myself this evening, it's to have the opportunity to say thank you, a big thank you, to all the colleagues, friends, family, and the organisations. We sometimes don't think about thanking the organisations that support us, who've made it possible for me to be speaking to you here today. Now, there are too many of you to name, so forgive me, I'm not going to try, but thank you all. Some of your names will come up. If yours doesn't, I hope you know who you are. And I thank you all. I am going to, however, say a very special and a very big thank you to my wife Anne over here. And this is actually the first time Anne's heard me speak. In public, that is. And also my sister Diane here, who was there from the start. She knows the whole story, and is not just my big sister, but also was also my partner in general practice for almost 25 years. So I'm delighted that Anne and Diane are sitting at the front here. So here's my plan to try and fill this awkward gap between now and the sandwiches. I'm first going to introduce you briefly to our sponsor, Dr. William Pickles, and I'd like to tell you how his story does resonate with some of my own story. I'm then going to focus on what has not been my only pastime, my only passion, but really has been my main professional passion over the last 30 years, and that's teaching medical students in and about general practice. Why is it important? I believe it's not important just to me, but to everyone, because it's fundamentally important that the future doctors who are going to look after properly trained in the community where patient care mostly takes place, and also that we ensure we have the pipeline for future GPs who are going to look after all of us and all of our families and all of our patients in the future. So it matters. And I'm going to try and do this by talking about just a few of the developments in which I've been involved over the years, before finally sharing some brief thoughts about the future. So, as is traditional and I think appropriate in giving an eponymous lecture, I'm going to say a few words about William Pickles, Will Pickles of Wensleydale, apparently he was known as, and his legacy. And also why I do feel a personal connection with him and his generation of what you might call the early modern general practitioners. So Will Pickles was born in Leeds in 1885 and died in 1969, aged 84. He was the son of a doctor, John Pickles, and he was one of 6 brothers, all becoming doctors, 4 of them GPs. He studied medicine at Leeds, qualifying in 1910. And in 1913, after various locums and a stint as a ship's doctor, he became a GP in Wensleydale in Yorkshire, where he lived out the rest of his life with his wife Gertie and their family, living over the practice in the building where he practiced. And that's where he lived and worked for 50 years. But as well as looking after his patients day to day, William Pickles, and with the help of his Gertie, I suspect more help than perhaps he gave her credit, they kept detailed records of local disease patterns amongst their patients, particularly in relation to infectious diseases, so common at the time. He wrote up and published his observations. He had a couple of BMJ papers in the early 30s. But in 1939, his book Epidemiology in Country Practice was published and actually became a classic, bringing him national and international recognition. And when I arrived this evening, I was so delighted and touched that Amanda gave me this copy of the book, which is now out of print, so quite hard to come by. And this is a copy of William Pickles' Epidemiology in Country Practice, 1939. So if anyone wants to have a look at that very gently at the end, please come. And thanks, Amanda. His fame actually did go far and wide, and evidenced here on the right of the screen there by a feature, believe it or not, in the Australian Women's Weekly, when he was on a lecture tour down under, which must have been a big thing for an English country. How would you get to Australia in 1950? That must have been quite... Yeah, take weeks. Yeah. Dr. Pickles was also instrumental in setting up this college and became its first president from 1953 to 1956. As you can see, this is actually the first ever research newsletter of what was then the College of General Practitioners, because it wasn't a royal college until 1972 when it got a royal charter. Rather recent, by the way, compared to the Royal College of Physicians, which was 1518. Surgeons was 1800. So the Pickles story seems a long time ago now, but it does still resonate for me personally, as I'm also the son of a GP, Maurice Rosenthal, who practiced in Liverpool for almost 50 years, overlapping for more than 20 of those with William Pickles, working less than 100 miles. I don't think they ever met, but it's possible they might have been in the same room sometime at a conference or something of Northern GPs. So here's my dad, Maurice, sitting at the desk where he sat, seeing his patients almost every day, certainly 6 days a week and sometimes 7, for nearly 50 years. And here's a picture next to that of, it's actually a painting given to the family by his patients and staff when he sadly died in 1990. But this is the house where I grew up, and Diane and our sister Greta, literally living above the shop, sometimes to be seen by the patients going through the waiting room in our pyjamas off to bed. My mother Betty here wasn't a doctor, but I'm sure she would have liked to be. It was hard then for women to train as doctors, but like Gertie Pickles, she was very much part of the practice, and was actually originally a teacher, which I'm sure influenced the draw for me to education and training in the context of medicine. And here across the bottom, my two sisters and me, all pictured sitting at that same desk. There's Greta on the left. She went on to become a psychiatrist in Canada, where she sadly died in 2018. Diane in the middle, who's here at the front, she also became a GP in London, and as I say, we were partners together for more than 20 years in practice, and I'm delighted Diane's here to share these memories. Diane still has the desk, by the way, in her study, in her house. And yet, on the right is an even slimmer and even darker haired version of me. I think I was a medical student at the time. I'm sure Diane will agree that our first-hand experience of seeing our father's and also our mother's dedication to pickle-style general practice did inspire all three of us to become doctors and has guided us throughout our careers. So, moving on, having grown up immersed in this perhaps nowadays quaint-sounding world of general practice, off I went to medical school in Cardiff in the early 80s. I went to Cardiff, Diane went to Scotland, and Greta went to Dublin, so we were kind of spread around the nations. But I found myself in Cardiff, which was great, in the early 80s, and I was very excited for this journey ahead to become a doctor. And it was a great journey, hard work, enjoyable throughout. But what kind of training did we have? Well, we were taught very well about basic sciences, and we gained fantastic clinical experience in hospital medicine. But all the time as a student, I kept wondering, when are we going to learn about general practice? This gap seemed very strange to me when I knew that most people's encounters with doctors must surely be with their GP. If you say, I'm going to see the doctor, what do you mean? You're going to see your GP. And I also knew, and they did often tell us, that about half of us would almost certainly go on to become GPs. To be fair, as they say in Cardiff, we did have, is it a Cardiff? It's a Cardiff thing, isn't it? A Welsh thing. To be fair, we did have a couple of lectures by GPs, and they were good, and a couple of days when we went to visit a local practice, and they were great, but it was really rather token. But in spite of this lack of training, in effect, I remained undeterred in my ambition to become a GP. And at that time, as I came towards, I was drawn to the bright lights of London, perhaps because Diane was already there, and I enjoyed visiting her and seeing the life she had as a GP training in London. So I applied for London GP training schemes, and I was lucky enough to get on what was then the Guy's Hospital GP vocational training scheme. So arriving in London from Wales in 1987, I started my first GP training post at Princess Street Group Practice at the Elephant and Castle. South Londoners, I'm sure, will know the place which still thrives in a great practice. I felt kind of at home, but I thought, like, now I'm learning to be a GP. And it was a fascinating patient population. All human life passed through the Elephant and Castle in those days, and we saw that all of those patients, from the homeless to Home Office ministers, even the Home Secretary at one occasion. And they all got equally great care at Princess Street. And it was 24-hour care. We did all our own nights and weekends, including the trainees. But it became clear to me from day one, working in real-life general practice, that whilst medical school had prepared us pretty well for diagnosing and managing common and serious diseases, it had provided us with few tools to understand and really care for people's health and illness in the broader sense, to understand what I later learned to call generalist, holistic patient care. Postgraduate general practice in those days did a great job of bringing us up to speed on this, but I couldn't help wondering why medical school hadn't for the realities. And it was during the same time as I went through 2 more years, as you had then to do for GP training, of hospital jobs, busy, very busy jobs, but really valuable. And I learned a lot, and I met some great people, including Janice, who was my registrar when I was an SHO in gynecology. It was a great training, but all through feeling it's not quite what I need to be a GP. But one thing about being at Guy's, obviously a great teaching hospital, I did get to do teaching of medical students on the ward, which I really liked, and I'm sure gave me a taste and made me think about finding a career that combined teaching and practice. So 3 years of GP training came to an end, and I was considering what to do next. And it was actually Diane again who I have to thank for sending me an advert she'd seen in I think a GP newsletter about a lecturer post coming up at what was then the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine. I applied for the job and was fortunate to get it. And luckily for me, as it happened, the GP had moved on from the practice at that time, so I was also able to tie that medical school job in with joining Diane and her partner Enid Greenbury in their practice to do my clinical sessions in parallel with the new medical school job. The practice was split across two surgeries, one in Harrogate, one in Islington, and after a year or so, Diane and Enid kindly offered me a partnership which lasted 22 years until they both retired. And I'm still actually working at the same practice today, thanks to our two fabulous new partners, Tammy and Neil Barry, who I think might be out there on YouTube. So thanks for keeping me on, Tammy and Neil. So it's still a family practice. Tammy and Neil are married, and Neil's father ran the practice before him. So going back to the medical school, when I joined the Royal Free, Margaret Lloyd, who again I say hello to on YouTube, I think she's tuned in. Professor Margaret Lloyd was the only GP senior lecturer in what was then the department at the Royal Free of Epidemiology and Public Health. And I was the first lecturer to join her. So we were a very small GP teaching group. There were a couple of sort of 1 or 2 session GPs locally who helped us out. But I would like to thank you, Margaret, if you're listening, for giving me that job and being my mentor and friend ever since. So at that time, Royal Free students did have a bit of general practice, probably about the equivalent of 4 weeks, which out of 5 years of medical training is not a great deal. Margaret and I, however, did share a passion to raise both the content and the profile of general practice in the undergraduate curriculum, not just to encourage students to consider a career in general practice, but to create well-rounded doctors who were prepared to provide patient-centred, evidence-based care in any branch of medicine they may go on to work in. And this was the early 1990s, and some important things were happening around that time which actually helped our cause. Patient stays in hospital were getting much shorter as more care moved into the community, but particularly mental health, but not only mental health. Treatments had become more perhaps efficient, if that's the word, and people were not in hospital for long, like when some of us earlier were students, when they'd be in the wards probably for 10 days after their gallbladder or hernia, with plenty of time to chat to students. Smaller hospitals were closing and bed numbers were shrinking. Also at this time, the GMC, the General Medical Council, who regulate undergraduate medical education, among other things, they produced the first edition of a document called Tomorrow's Doctors. And this included, for the first time, a recommendation for greater emphasis on community-based medical education. So probably for all these combination of reasons, the medical school became more receptive to the idea that students might possibly be able to learn something in general practice, and in brackets, reduce pressure on the hospital wards. Also around this time, the Tomlinson report on healthcare in London came out from the Department of Health, recognising the need to improve recruitment in London. Among other things, this resulted in something called the LISI programme. Some of the people in the room I know will remember the London Initiative Zone Educational Incentives Programme. Slightly long-winded, but LISI was its nickname. And for 3 years, between 1995 and 98, that programme provided fairly generous opportunities to develop undergraduate and also postgraduate GP educational initiatives. And one of those initiatives was called CEMENT, Community-Based Medical Education in North Thames. We love acronyms. Now, I've seen, delighted Paul Bouton, Anita Berlin are in the room. They were key figures in the CEMENT project. Paul then at King's, Anita at Imperial. I was at Royal Free, and we together worked on developing new programmes across London. And if you'll allow me at this point, I would just like to pay tribute briefly to 2 colleagues who, among many other things, were both central to the CEMENT project. Both have sadly passed away within the last year, Elizabeth Murray and Paul Wallace. They both made enormous contributions to academic primary care, and both are sadly missed. So jumping back now to the mid-1990s at the Royal Free. Over these years, Margaret and I minded colleagues, some of whom are here today, Surinder, Melvin, Richard, nice to see you. We worked together, coming up with new course ideas, some of which are listed here, and most of which continue to this day. Royal Free and UCL neighbouring medical school gradually merged into one between 1998 and 2000, which really helped build up our academic department for both teaching and research. But with these teaching programmes, we usually piloted them with small groups of students, and it was invariable that we got positive feedback, and that very much helped us persuade the medical school to roll them out to larger groups, to all the students. And this momentum allowed us to do some important things, including expanding GP eventually into all 5 years of the medical curriculum. Funding academic posts, this was important to bring in GPs to take on academic roles, research and teaching, to build up a faculty of GPs as a department in the medical school. Also, very importantly, it provided us with funding for new teaching administrator posts, essential to make things happen. And also vital to build up our network of local practices and some practices further afield, willing to offer placements to medical students for what was then still very minimal payment from the medical school. More on that later. Around this time, the medical school even approved what was then a quite radical proposal led by Margaret to offer students the option of a 1-year intercalated BSc in primary care. So this is for medical students to take a year out to focus on a particular area. They've already been doing it on things like anatomy and physiology and neurology, but there hadn't been one for primary care, and that started in 97, I think, and was led initially by Melvin, who's here, and then by Surinder, who's also here, and now by Sarah Armstrong, who might be watching us. Also around that time, we set up early on a primary care education research group, recognising that it's important to do stuff, but it's also important to work out if it works and how it could be done better. And that group's latterly been led and very much built up by Sophie Park, who's here, and I'd like to see Sophie, who has really contributed significantly to the theory and practice in GP and community-based undergraduate teaching. But Royal Free, by now UCL Medical School, wasn't the only school where things were changing. And throughout this period, similar developments were taking place to a greater or lesser extent around the UK. But whilst all of us in medical schools, GPs working in medical schools, were facing similar needs and challenges, we tended to work quite independently, often spending time reinventing the same wheel. This, however, started to change in 2009 when at an SAPC, Society for Academic Primary Care, annual meeting in St Andrews, the idea came up of forming a national group of GP teaching leads in all UK medical schools. I think some of you were at that meeting. Adrian, I remember, was there, Amanda. And so this idea, this name, HOTS, seemed to stick. There was already a HODS group, Heads of Departments of General Practice. So we'll have a HOTS group, Heads of Teaching General Practice. And Bob McKinley, who I mentioned earlier, and myself somehow came away from that meeting, volunteered as co-chairs to set it up and take the idea forward. Our first formal meeting was in December 2009 in Warwick, and somehow things took off from there. And if there's one development which I've been involved in over the years that I think has made a difference, this is it, this collaboration between GP teaching leads. The HOTS group now has representation from all medical schools in the UK and Ireland, of which there are now over 50 if we include all new and emerging schools. So how could we best describe the HOTS? I'm sure many of us are familiar with the term community of practice, and I think the HOTS group really does fit the definition here of a group of people who share a concern or a passion for something they do and learn how to do it better as they interact regularly. And I think it's fair to say that the HOTS Group has facilitated collaboration, innovation and development of shared resources in a way almost certainly unprecedented in UK medical education. We meet formally twice a year, currently co-chaired by Joe Prothero from Keele and myself. We have an active online network in between meetings and a number of subgroups, working groups, and we have become recognised as the national representative group for undergraduate GP teaching in the UK. So, if you'll indulge me for the rest of this talk, my plan is to run through three particular areas of development in undergraduate GP teaching that not just me, but we, as a HOTS group, have successfully taken forward in recent years. Let's call them hot topics. So the first is about development in funding of GP teaching in medical schools. The second around developing an agreed curriculum for GP teaching, which, believe it or not, didn't exist until quite recently. And the third is to touch on the development of some innovative resources to share across students in all medical schools, produced only because of the work and kindness of the HOTS group. So the first of those stories is about money, because as we all know, money talks. And training doctors is an expensive business. The most reliable figure I can find on this currently is around £240,000 to get a student from their first year to graduation and medical school. And in England this is funded in three ways. Tuition fees, as paid by the students themselves, often on a loan, which are currently £9,250 a year. There's a chunk of money, a significant chunk of money comes from the Department of Education, as it does for all universities, not specifically medical schools, via something called the Office for Students, formerly known as HEFSI, and this is specifically for central university running costs, things like arranging admissions, assessment, teaching of non-clinical teaching, basic sciences and so on. It's NHS funding, specifically for clinical placements. This used to be called SIFT, stands for Service Increment for Teaching, but is now called Education and Training Tariff. And it's this third element which, for us, has been the most interesting one over recent years with respect to GPs teaching in their practices. And just to share a bit of history here, as we're in a slightly historical lecture, and we don't often get a chance to reflect on the past and our ancestors, if you like. So these clinical placement costs were only actually formally recognised at all by the NHS in 1976, when SIFT was introduced. But SIFT at this point was available only for teaching hospitals, not for GPs. So while there were in the 70s and 80s a small number of GPs offering placements to medical students, they did it because they believed it was the right thing to do and a good thing to do, but it was essentially on a voluntary basis, or little bits of locally negotiated funding through medical schools. It was only some 15 years later, thanks to negotiation by colleagues now retired like John Howie, George Freeman and others, that some SIFT was made available to general practices for the first time in 1992, around the time I was getting into the business. Initially, the rate was £12.50 per half-day session, so £25 a day, which, wasn't a princely sum, but it was enough to make a difference. But the thing is, it was more than a third less students, which doesn't seem quite fair. And although that SIFT for general practice rate crept up slightly over time with inflation, a little 1% here in some years, maybe 1.5%, it never did catch up with what the hospitals were paying, and this inequality continued until 2013, when the Department of Health introduced a new payment system replacing SIFT. They called it tariffs, but even then it only applied to hospitals, and general practices who were teaching were still paid on this historical locally negotiated SIFT arrangement. So we're up to 2013 now. And the HOTS group was pretty much established by then and was getting increasingly exercised by the fact that we were trying to place more and more students in general practice, but only able to offer payments that were significantly lower than hospital placements, and a payment which had been pretty much static for about 10 previous years. So you can only fight so many battles, and we picked our battle to try and resolve, our priority battle to resolve this inequity, and we set about lobbying government, Royal College GPs, BMA and anyone else who would listen to recognise the need for realistic and equitable funding in order to provide sufficient quality of placements for students in general practice. Because this is the only way, we believe, to ensure a future medical for modern NHS. This tide, I'm sure, did start to turn when in 2018 the HOTS group, in partnership with the Department of Health, coordinated a detailed costing study of 50 teaching practices. So we got each HOT to volunteer a couple of teaching practices in their area to agree to do a fairly detailed costing exercise, filling in a template for all their teaching costs. And what this study for the first time provided was evidence, figures, to persuade the government and the negotiators that the cost of providing undergraduate placements in general practice was considerably more than they were currently receiving, and in fact pretty much the same as the cost of training in hospital, because by far most of the cost is about clinicians' time taken away from their service to supervise and teach the students. And this study did seem to win the argument that there should be a flat tariff price which funded GP and community placements at the same rate as hospital placements. And to cut a long story short, this so-called harmonised tariff was finally introduced 2 years ago in March 2022, ending 40 years of chronic underfunding of GP undergraduate placements. This really has allowed us to increase significantly the payments to practices for taking students, and palpably helped us to maintain and build up our GP placement capacity. And along with the increased funding, the new tariff included new guidance drafted again largely by members of the HOTS group led by Richard Darnton, who I think is tuned in, and Alex Harding, and myself, how the money should flow and be managed, what you might call the mechanism of the SIP payments, now tariff payments. And this has ensured that all medical schools must have a named head of GP teaching and a properly funded group to support their mission. Money isn't everything, but better payment has certainly helped us encourage busy practices to provide much needed clinical experience for tomorrow's doctors. So moving on to the second hot topic, this is about curriculum. And believe it or not, before 2018, there was no nationally agreed guidance as to what medical schools should be teaching in and about general practice. Historically, they'd each evolved their own GP teaching activities, mainly on a pragmatic basis. So this is briefly the story of a document called Teaching General Practice. And again, it's all down to the HOTS group recognising this curriculum gap and working together to review the evidence and come to a consensus as to what were the particular areas where GPs can add value to medical education. We can teach students how to look in ears and look in throats and listen to chests, but that's not necessarily adding value. There are things that they can only learn by going out into general practice and tend not to be covered in other parts of the curriculum. So Alex Harding from Exeter was the driving force for this project, and we worked very closely on this with the college, in particular Camilla Hawthorne, who was then our chair of council and was one of the co-authors of the Teaching General Practice document. And also was invaluable in taking this project forward. So the resulting document provides recommendations for all UK medical schools as to how best to provide GP teaching. It's not a one-size-fits-all curriculum or a detailed syllabus listing all the things students can or should learn in practice. And in fact, it consciously doesn't cover any clinical topics or conditions, which we feel are pretty well covered elsewhere. but instead it aims to provide a set of underlying guiding principles of primary care, allowing space for individual programmes to adapt and innovate. The document sets out guidance under three overarching themes, which we called person-centred care, population-centred care, and effective delivery of care. Perhaps easier to remember as the three Ps: the patient, the population, and the practice. And under each of these overarching themes, we set out a set of principles which we recommend to be covered as a minimum in any undergraduate GP curriculum. And you can see the list of themes and principles on this slide. Now, things change, and this is a dynamic document. It's already in its second edition. But we know that medical schools, including the new ones coming on stream recently, and some internationally, are using it to inform thinking and curriculum planning. So we hope that's been an important contribution of the HOTS group. My third and final hot topic is about the development of shared learning resources for students and their teachers. And I'm going to mention three of the projects around resources just briefly, and they're learning general practice, virtual primary care, and near-peer teaching. So starting with learning general practice, so we had teaching general practice, the document for medical school curriculum planners, and this is the sister document, Learning General Practice, which is a free digital textbook for medical students available on the RCGP website. It's free, it's in the public domain. Again, very much a HOTS RCGP collaboration with about 30 members of the HOTS group contributing essays, in effect, short, bite-sized chunks summarising key topics. And we asked them to keep those to below 2,000 words because we know students' attention span is not always that long. So whereas teaching general practice is aimed, as I said, curriculum planners, this document is aimed at students and also their tutors in the practice. And it works as an interactive PDF with the short, discrete chapters explaining each of the principles, complemented with suggested further reading and also practical activities that students can do in their practice placements to help them learn about each of the topics. So if you click on the blue index pane on the right, it takes you to the relevant topic with the essay to introduce the topic, and then you click on associated sections for further reading and tasks. Obviously the risk with any textbook is that it'll rapidly go out of date, but with this digital approach, it does make revisions, updates and improvements over time much easier to manage. Moving on to virtual primary care. Has anyone seen GPs Behind Closed Doors on Channel 5? It's actually been around since 2014, but I think many of us as GPs kind of don't, we've seen enough perhaps in real life to watch reality television of GPs. But it's out there and it's popular, it's successful. I think it's in Series 8 now. Well, the next learning resource actually emerged from that TV programme and a collaboration with the production company. It's basically a library of 150 professionally recorded authentic GP consultations now available for teaching purposes in all UK and Irish medical schools. So it's not like, you know, we might do for a trainee video, you put your video camera or your phone in the corner. They had, in each practice they recorded, they had a dedicated production room. There were 4 cameras in every room, all on remote control, and it's the best quality video, the best quality sound, professionally edited recordings, so that they really are a step above the sort of videos I'd seen before anyway. And just a bit about the evolution of this project. It was again a HOTS-led innovation, born actually very much out of concern, if not panic, at the start of the pandemic, when we realised that GPs we were supposed to be placing practices weren't going to be possibly going out at all, or if they were, not seeing any patients, any real patients, just phone calls, maybe the occasional video, for an unknown period of time. I don't think any of us believed when Boris said it'd be 3 weeks, it was going to be 3 weeks. So, you know, everything just stopped on about September the 12th. I'm sure many of us here remember those emails flying around. What are we going to do? So a little group, a small group of the HOTS, we set up a small virtual learning group to think about how we could work together to create material and share material to keep the students amused, basically, in these weeks or months of lockdown. And one of the group, Dr. Jane Kirby, who I hope may be watching, Jane is the HOT at Leeds, mentioned that she worked in Leeds with a local practice where filming had been happening for GPs behind closed doors, and she'd actually heard about it from her students who said they learned quite a lot, possibly more than on their GP placements from watching this. So a sort of light bulb came on. We realised that somewhere at Channel 5 there were probably hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of material which could potentially be adapted for teaching use. So to cut a long story short, Jane made the initial contact with Channel 5, who introduced us to the production company who actually make the programme, who go by the name of Knickerbocker Glory. And they were fantastic. They immediately, firstly, they had nothing to do. They were locked down. They couldn't make any programmes. They were struggling, and they wanted to help, and they were immediately supportive of this idea of helping train doctors what's not to like. And they agreed to help us at cost, which doesn't mean free, because there is a cost for them of getting the material up to scratch, editing it, selecting the right material for teaching purposes, and all of that was going to cost, they said initially, about 60,000. It was more, but initially they said about £60,000. We didn't have a budget, so we scratched our heads. We thought about crowdfunding, and we spoke to people, and fortunately, I had a chat to Katie Petty-Saffon, Chief Executive of the Medical Schools Council, who really liked the idea, took it to Medical Schools Council, who within, it was possibly less than 24 hours, I think, agreed to fund the whole project, host it on their website, and support it. Because it needs ongoing support. Any sort of active website, you have to have people who will keep it running and respond to queries if you can't log in, all that kind of stuff. They agreed to do that. And this really was a turning point, and we're so grateful to Katie and the Medical Schools Council for the support they've provided for this project. So to get it actually happening, we quickly set up a small editorial team, and after a very busy few lockdown weeks selecting the videos, making sure that there were a very diverse range, both clinically, also diverse in the type of patients, the type of clinicians. It wasn't just GPs, it was nurses, counsellors, some physios, a diverse range of videos. And we engaged our HOT colleagues to share out the videos once we got them, and write a commentary, an educational commentary for each one, with a summary of the learning points and some exercises again that students could do, and some further reading. Everyone was great, everyone chipped in, and within 6 months we had launched the website. I think if it hadn't been for COVID, that one probably would have taken at least 2 years. So VPC is up and running. It was fantastic during lockdown, but it's continued to be used in different ways, and some medical schools have really embedded it into their teaching programs. It's had already over 3 million minutes of use logged across 50 medical schools. So if this works, I'm just going to show you 1 minute of it. It's not an actual video. We can't show the videos in public. It's for confidentiality and licensing reasons, but I can show you this little tutorial.
Firstly, I'm just going to show you that you can just scroll
how it
through
works.
all the 150 videos, but to make it a bit more simple, there are some functions within the website. So firstly, you could search just by typing. So you can see here, I could search for anxiety and hit the search button, and there you go, it's filtered down to 21 videos. You could also click on one of our keywords. So, for example, again, if you wanted to look at anxiety or consultations involving a neck lump, you can click that and you'll see, again, it filters it down to 2 videos. Or you can use the filter function itself, which has 3 separate drop-downs. So if you wanted to filter for clinical condition, for example, and you decided you wanted to do an ear, nose and throat tutorial, You could click on that and filter the videos for ear, nose and throat, and you'll see it brings up 16 videos. Or you could search using outcomes for graduates, so GMC outcomes for graduates. For example, these are a bit more wordy, but you may want to look at the professional skills and, for example, look at prescribing and decide that's something you want to focus on, and you'll filter your videos and you'll see there's 44 videos that involve prescribing. And finally, you can filter using the Teaching General Practice resource, and you may want to teach on, for example, multimorbidity and complexity, and again, if you click filter videos, you'll see it reduces it down, so down to 38 videos. So there's 4 different ways: searching by typing, and you can use more than one word, searching by clicking on the keywords, or using the filters. Okay, so if you decided to pick your video, so for example this one,
you get the sense of
which is
the functionality. Thank you to Jane. She did give permission to use that tutorial clip. That was Jane Kirby's voice you heard there. So hopefully that gives you a sense of that particular learning resource. And as I say, the actual videos, it was blurred out there, but the actual videos are really high quality. And if any of you are involved in undergraduate teaching, you can contact your local head of teaching to get access to the library and see it for yourself. And I suspect some of you involved in GP postgraduate training might be thinking, we could use that. Well, you can't yet, but we are, because of the licensing arrangements, but we have now developed a version for postgraduate GP trainees who actually it'll probably be more useful, particularly international medical graduates who perhaps have never worked in the NHS before. So it is being piloted and it's been evaluated, and trainees like it, and we're now at the stage of trying to persuade the NHS to fund it, which is not easy. And so, my final story for this evening is about near-peer teaching in general practice, an innovation which many of us believe is one of the keys to the future sustainability of GP teaching. The term near-peer teaching can be applied to any form of teaching where the tutor is at or near the same stage of training as the student. It can happen from primary school upwards, and it is used in secondary schools and other places, so it's not really an innovation, but the innovation, I guess, is trying to get it into general practice, because I'm sure most of us remember who are medics being mostly taught in hospital by SHOs, registrars, senior registrars. Yes, consultant teaching was important, but it wasn't the main thing. And we have all these GP trainees coming out into practice, often with a lot of experience. They've been medical registrars or O&G registrars, or even if they've just done 6 months in a couple of different jobs, they are doctors and they've got a lot of experience, and we somehow are protecting them from helping medical students to learn. So we've been trying to harness that energy, and in some areas we've done it well, but I have to say there has been resistance in some areas where our postgraduate colleagues are saying, well, we don't want our trainees to work for medical school, they're here to learn to see patients. Well, I have to say I think that's a rather short-sighted view, because the trainees love it, they learn a lot from it, and the students love it too. Just to be clear, we're not asking these GP trainees to teach medical students how to be a GP or about general practice, but rather getting them to teach sort of topics that would in the past have been taught largely in hospitals, so history and examination, general medicine, clinical skills, those sort of things. They're great. They're nearer their learning, they're nearer their final exams, and they understand what the students need to learn. The students feel perhaps a bit more comfortable asking questions that they'd be scared to ask the professors about. Oops, sorry. So it's actually a fairly simple idea, and we have been using UCL for a number of years now. We started in just one GP scheme with one trainee doing what we called an innovative training post, an ITP in medical education, where they spent maybe a day a week teaching students in their training practice. That went well, and in collaboration with the London GP Postgraduate School, and in particular Sanjeev Ahluwalia, who was head of school and later the postgraduate dean, we rolled that out to all the North Central London schemes, and we've now got about a quarter of our Year 4 students doing a programme called Medicine in the Community, where they go out a day a month to general practice. About a quarter of our 4th year, so that's about 100 students each year, are taught by GP trainees. And it gets great feedback. We have evaluated it. Melvin here has done a lot of work on this. And it really is a significant contribution to placement capacity, which is still in short supply. And we keep saying everyone's a winner. Students enjoy being taught by a tutor close to their stage and age of training. The trainees learn. They learn. You know, if they know they're going to be teaching students about ECGs next week, they're going to read it up and they're going to know about ECGs a bit more. And they enjoy the teaching and the feedback they get. The practices are happy because the trainees enjoy their job and the students are happy, and they get paid because money follows the students into the practice. And the medical school's happy because our placement capacity has increased. So, just to conclude and say a few words about, I'm over time, sorry, about the future. I guess I'm hoping my take-home messages are here to say that undergraduate general practice has indeed come of age over the last 30 years. It's now established as an essential part of training for all future doctors. Old arguments about the quality of GP teaching and the need for equitable funding are one. And the other message is that collaborative working, this sort of ideas I've talked about through working with colleagues across different medical schools, does get results. Cooperation rather than competition. But briefly, what of the future? Medical student numbers are increasing and new medical schools coming on stream. General practices are under increasing service pressures, as we all know, and also demands to provide placements and supervision not just for medical students but for postgraduate GP trainees, other important healthcare learners like nurses, pharmacists, physicians associates, paramedics, all of which takes up time and physical space. How can we fit all this in? There are, of course, interesting developments in technology around virtual placements, simulated consultations, use of AI, all exciting and will no doubt make their contribution. But the challenge, I believe, remains to ensure that all medical students should have sufficient experience of authentic GP placements where they can meet real patients in the real world, in real general practice. This may take some radical solutions, as my colleague from Newcastle, Hugh Alberti, has aptly put it. And one of those ideas, as we suggested in this recent BJGP editorial, is that we should move to a position where all general practices are teaching practices. Working together, we believe this can happen with appropriate training, funding and support to ensure the best possible training for our future doctors and so the best possible care for future patients. So for the last word, and I'm sorry to run over time, but for the last word I'd like to leave you with this recent quote, genuine I promise, and not unusual in its sentiment from a UCL student at the end of a 6-week GP placement. My placement at this surgery has been the best clinical placement during my time in medical school. Everyone was kind, open-minded and engaged. All the doctors I saw taught me about something very special to them, and I've gained a whole plethora of role models to emulate. Both a truly great learning experience and a huge motivational push to engage with the course and medicine in general. If this practice represents the future of the NHS, I am very excited about the future of medicine. Thank you. The end.
Joe, thank you very much. you said in one of your slides, everyone's a winner. I think we've been a winner tonight with such an erudite discussion and taking us through the history. I think that boy who was in your GP surgery's father with his pyjamas in the surgery would never have imagined that he would have sort of had such a wonderful career, touched so many lives and made such a difference. And I think thank you very much. And thank you for your attention.
Richard, we're over time, and I'm sure people want to go and have a snack, but if anyone does want to say anything or ask questions here or later, please.
Joe's going to be around. He'll answer as many questions as you want. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for those of us who joined online, and we wish you a good evening. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Can I take the gown off now? It's hot, too hot.